Coming up on this Monday edition of Newsline at Noon, South Korea's National Assembly seeks the passage of bills to press North Korea to end its human rights abuses despite Pyongyang's threats to retaliate against nations joining a UN resolution on this issue. Korea is facing the urgent need to utilize more female and foreign workers as the country is fast turning into a super-age society. Plus, world powers consider extending talks for a deal with Iran aimed at curbing its nuclear activities beyond Monday's deadline. These stories and more on Newsline at Noon.
It's New Monday, November 24th here in Korea. Thanks for tuning in. Live from Seoul, I'm Eoh Jin-joo.
It's very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broome. Our top story this afternoon, taking the United Nations lead, South Korea's National Assembly has a renewed sense of urgency to pass bills related to North Korea's grave human rights violations.
The idea was first broached in Parliament all the way back in 2005, and while the rival parties are making a fresh push, they remain far apart on the details. Our Seoul reports.
The National Assembly is stepping up efforts to pass bills on North Korean human rights, in line with recent efforts from the international community. The Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee on Monday began reviewing two bills related to North Korean human rights, one proposed by the ruling Saenuri Party and the other by the main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy. The ruling party's bill focuses on documenting violations carried out by Pyongyang and developing plans to improve human rights conditions in the north. The main opposition's bill puts an emphasis on supporting the North Korean people through humanitarian aid. Both parties say they hope to pass these bills by the end of this year, but they'll first have to resolve their long-standing differences over the issue. A main source of contention is a suggestion from the ruling Saenuri Party that the human rights bill include government assistance to activist groups that fly anti-North Korea leaflets across the border. The main opposition party says if the bill includes any language indicating support for such groups, they will not pass it. Myung-gil, Arirang News.
Lots of newly married couples these days choose to have just one child or even none at all due to the high financial cost of raising kids in Korea, or just because they'd rather focus on climbing the career ladder. However, this has led to a chronically low birth rate in the nation, and experts are now calling for long-term investment in government policies aimed at reversing that trend. Kim Min-ji reports.
There was a time in the not-so-distant past when Korea promoted birth control and encouraged families to have fewer children. In the 1980s, the nation's population topped 40 million, and the government, acting on the fear that overpopulation would take a toll on food and housing supplies, rolled out a one-child campaign. It worked, and now, along with other factors, Korea has one of the lowest birth rates in the world.
Latest figures show that Korea's average fertility rate, which represents the number of children a woman is expected to have during her lifetime, is estimated at 1.3. That's the third lowest among 198 countries and well below the world average of 2.5.
Whether it be the high cost of raising a child or more women choosing their careers over motherhood, a growing number of couples are deciding to hold off on having kids. 29-year-old teacher Park Eun-ju says it's why she isn't a mom yet, even though she's been married for 2 years.
If I have a baby, my life will have to be centered around the child. Also, after becoming a mother, I may not be able to get a good enough job, and this will then lower my overall standard of living.
Park and others like her hope the government will offer more incentives like higher family support allowances and tax breaks to encourage women to give birth. However, OECD data shows the Korean government's spending to GDP on such benefits is one of the lowest among member nations. Some experts also say Korea's hyper-competitive society could be another factor keeping the fertility rate down.
If the government gives parents assurances that their children will be able to enjoy a standard level of happiness by getting an average education and landing an average job and working diligently, then the birth rate will naturally go up.
The expert added the government will have to invest more money and time into strengthening its child care and welfare policies to build public trust in the measures before it can expect to see the birth rate improve. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Now, Korea's very low birth rate, along with its quickly aging population, are two major factors that are contributing to a historically significant shift in the ratio of women to men in the country. Showing us how things are expected to change in the coming years, here's Shin Se-min.
The nation's population is about to undergo a major change in the next year. Women will outnumber men for the first time since 1960. Statistics Korea predicts that the number of women will stand at over 25.31 million by 2015, outnumbering men by 10,000. The agency attributed the change to two major social issues facing the country: the low birth rate and the rapid aging of the population. There are still more boys born in Korea than girls, but given that women have a longer life expectancy than men, their numbers will still be higher overall. But that's not all. The number of people over the age of 65 is also expected to grow rapidly to more than 7.1 million by 2017 from 6.4 million this year. The nation first became an aging society in the year 2000 when just 7% of the population was over 65. But at the current rate, the country could become a super-aged society in 2026, when over 20% of its population will be over 65. Given these trends, the labor force is expected to fall, eventually pulling down the nation's growth rate. Experts say that to combat the low birth rate and aging population, and to prevent the economic growth rate falling in the longer term, the government must utilize a workforce of women, the elderly, and foreigners, and programs and services for these groups must be improved. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Now, China appears to be upping the ante amid escalating territorial disputes in the East and South China Seas. New reports indicate Beijing is building an artificial island in disputed waters and plans to turn it into an ocean airfield. Connie Lee has more.
Satellite imagery suggests that China is building an artificial island that could be turned into an airfield. According to U.S. military spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Jeffrey Poole, China is working toward building that airfield as part of a vast land reclamation project in the Spratly Islands located in the South China Sea. Now, the location of this island is what's raising concerns. It is being built in waters where Beijing is currently locked in territorial disputes with neighboring countries like the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. The U.S. has long urged China to refrain from provocative acts in the area and has called on China to halt the project. Lieutenant Colonel Poole said the U.S. urges China to stop its land reclamation program, adding that China should engage in diplomatic initiatives to encourage all sides to restrain themselves in these sorts of activities. The satellite images and a report from the defense publication IHS Jane's Defense show that China has been using dredgers for the past 3 months to build the island, which is massive in size. It's about 3,000 meters long and up to 300 meters wide on the reef, which was previously underwater. The report adds that the dredgers are also creating a harbor big enough to dock tankers and other warships. With its latest move, it appears China is asserting its claims in the South China Sea. At an international conference in Beijing over the weekend on new regional security architecture, China's vice foreign minister said that Asian countries bear primary responsibility of their region. Connie Lee, Arirang News.
And now for a check on some of the other global headlines, let's connect to our Eunice Kim at the News Center.
Eunice, 4 months ago, 6 world powers and Iran set today, November 24th, as the deadline for a final deal over Tehran's nuclear program. We're just hours away from that deadline now, and it appears even the Americans have conceded An agreement will not likely be reached in time, and now we're going to have to start thinking about extending this yet again.
That's right, Mark. It is about 4:10 in the morning right now in Vienna, where those talks have been taking place. A deal would potentially change Iran's relationship with the West after 3 decades of tension, but the two sides reportedly remain far apart, leaving questions as to what will happen next. Our Choi Yu-sun reports.
While the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and Germany make last-ditch efforts to reach an agreement on Iran's nuclear program by November 24th, expectations are that the deadline will be extended. Officials involved in talks in Vienna on Sunday said a second extension was being considered as the two sides were no way near a comprehensive agreement on Tehran curbing its nuclear development in return for the US and the EU lifting sanctions. The 6 powers already postponed the deadline once back in July. The so-called P5+1 and Iran differ significantly on how much of its nuclear program Iran should give up and when the international community should ease sanctions.
We're still quite a long way apart, and there are some very tough and complex issues to deal with, but we're all focused right now on trying to get that deal done.
While a comprehensive deal is unlikely to be realized by Monday, the BBC, citing Iranian sources, said a political agreement of some sort or a reference to parameters of a future deal may be announced.
I won't anticipate the results, but we're continuing to work. We have a final deadline for tomorrow night to find an agreement, but it has to be positive and enable us to work for peace.
Amid the uncertainties, Reuters, citing Iranian sources, says Tehran has a plan B that involves turning to Beijing and Moscow, both of which hold veto power at the UN for diplomatic and economic cooperation if no deal is made in Vienna. The feasibility of that plan, however, is being questioned as China faces a slowing economy at home and Russia is facing its own international sanctions for its intervention in Ukraine. Choi Yu-sun, Arirang News.
And what was supposed to be an evening of innocent fun quickly turned bloody when a suicide bomber struck a volleyball tournament in Afghanistan on Sunday. No one immediately took responsibility for the late afternoon strike that killed at least 45 people and hurt some 60 others. It happened in a small village in the country's Patika province. Spectators had come from neighboring districts for the tournament final that would pit 3 local volleyball teams. Officials said a vested bomber had detonated himself in the middle of a volleyball match. The attack came as Afghani lawmakers had approved a measure that would allow Americans and NATO soldiers to remain in the country into next year, even after most foreign troops withdraw next month. Already tense relations between Israelis and Palestinians have been ratcheted up a notch after a Palestinian farmer was shot dead by Israeli troops near a border area in Gaza on Sunday. It is the first fatality since an August truce ended a brutal 50-day war this summer within the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Health Ministry identified the deceased as 32-year-old Fadel Mohammed Halawa, who family say was hunting for songbirds to sell on the market to feed his children. The Israeli military confirmed its soldiers from an army watchtower had fired warning shots at 2 approaching individuals before firing at their lower extremities, hitting 1 person. Israel has long designated its border area with Gaza an off-limits zone for Palestinians on concerns of militant attacks.
Stay up to date on the latest news out of Korea, connecting to our team of reporters about the issues that matter to Korea. On air, on your mobile, online. Find out more about Korea on NEWSLINE at Noon with Mark Broome and Eoh Jin-joo.
I'm Eoh Jin-joo.
Market researcher, strategy analytics, said Thursday that LG Electronics brought in about 11.1.
More than half of Korea's largest companies saw their profits tumble in the first 3 quarters of the year due largely to the sluggish global economy. Market researcher Chaebol.com says the combined operating profits of 55 of the top 100 listed firms on the benchmark Kospi stood at roughly $23 billion from January to September. Now that's down almost 30% from the same period last year. And this drop has pushed the operating profit of all 100 listed firms put together down as well by more than 15% over the same period, with sales falling roughly 1.5% to around $590 billion. And the slowing economy has hit the labor market hard as well. Latest figures show 1 out of 4 people who changed jobs in Korea last year did so through no choice of their own. Statistics Korea says the number of workers forced to seek new employment stood at around 720,000 in 2013, which is up more than 100,000 from a year earlier. About half were laid off, while the other half had temporary job contracts expire. Lower income earners were hit the hardest, and the number of layoffs among those in the lowest 20% income bracket soared to 65,000 from 26,000 in 2012.
Now, competition is hotting up among the 3 competitors vying to win Korea's $1.3 billion project to procure 4 aerial tankers. The Korean Air Force aims to boost the amount of time its fighter jets can stay in the air because, as it stands, aerial patrols of Korea's outer reaches are rather limited. Our Son Jung-in reports.
As it stands now, Korea's F-15K fighter jets can operate for a maximum of 30 minutes over Korea's easternmost Dokdo Island and even less over the country's southernmost Eoh Island. The military is seeking ways to introduce a refueling aircraft system to extend the jet's operation time and generally strengthen its military capability. Boeing's KC-46 is a leading contender in the bidding process. The aerial tanker can carry up to 96 tons of fuel and up to 114 passengers with a cargo capacity of 188 tons. On top of its decent fuel efficiency and cheap operating costs, the aircraft is also fairly compact, which means it's able to land on relatively small airfields.
Really builds on the legacy of the 75 years of experience of the Boeing company with refueling aircraft. It's also interoperable with the U.S. Air Force and all of the coalition forces as well.
The only concern is that its development is expected to be completed in 2017, the same year the Korean Air Force plans to deploy the aerial tankers. Airbus's A330 MRTT, another potential candidate, is already developed and ready to go into operation. The tanker is huge, capable of carrying 260 people, 111 tons of fuel, and 37 tons of cargo, and is still able to conduct a variety of air-to-air refueling missions.
The A330 MRTT is capable of providing more fuel, transporting more passengers, and more payload during the same mission, and that is why we have won every single competition outside the U.S.
However, its applicability and landing is relatively limited due to its bulky size. Another strong challenger is Israel's IAI. It's offering a tanker based on the second-hand civil aircraft for around half the price of its competitors. Seoul is expected to announce the winner of the Defense Acquisition Program deal worth $1.3 billion early next year. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
Now, a slow ecological disaster is unfolding in the Andes. The World Bank says mountains that used to be coated with thick layers of ice and snow are receding at a very alarming pace. The organisation also warns that things are only going to get worse unless the world acts on climate change. Park Ji-won reports.
Most glaciers in the Andes will have completely melted away by the year 2080 if the world fails to counter the threat of climate change. This is the stark warning issued by the World Bank in its latest climate change report. It concludes the world's average temperature could rise by 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, if the world doesn't take appropriate actions to stop global warming. The report, which mostly focuses on Latin America, the Middle East, and North Africa, says glaciers have already significantly retreated in the Andes. It says that if the trend continues, cities around the mountain range could be at risk of flooding and freshwater supplies could start to dry up. The grim projection carries on by saying that if the average global temperature rises by more than 4 degrees Celsius, sea levels will rise by more than 60 centimeters. This would increase the risk of storms and tropical cyclones, especially for low-lying countries and small island states. The report also predicts that in the Middle East and North Africa, warmer average temperatures will threaten already scarce water resources and negatively affect crop yields. The report, drawn up from the work of international experts, calls on governments to aggressively tackle their carbon emissions. The report also urges the development of alternative energy, appropriate agricultural technologies, and raising the energy efficiency of buildings and public transport. 박지원, Arirang News.
Now, it's constantly being praised, but almost in equal measure it's called obsessive. It's Korea's fever with education, and to quell the thirst for more and better quality education, local firms here in Korea are constantly working to upgrade their materials.
Right, so today on this week's Industry Insight, our Kwon So-ah takes a look at how Korea's education content providers are expanding into the global arena.
The school bell doesn't signal the end of the day for many Korean students. They are out of their classrooms, but private tutors are waiting for them. This nearly $30 billion private education industry has given birth to advanced learning products. And some of them are finding their way overseas. Tintin English publishes storybooks for preschoolers in China and Thailand. The company is taking advantage of the craze for English in Korea that led to a booming English education market. Cheongsang Language School recently signed a contract with major U.S. book distributor IPG, and its products recorded sales of around $20,000 in their first 2 months on Amazon. Experts say assessing the current volume of export of educational contents is difficult, but Professor Lee Hyun-chung of Hanyang University estimates it's in the tens of millions of dollars.
Korea already has a good image as a very strong education country all over the world. Plus, we have a very strong IT techniques, so IT-based kind of learning package and the teaching package and the content development really attractive to foreign countries. That's combine these two, we can have easily have a second K wave. It's called the educational wave, I think.
Cheongdam Learning has integrated IT into its curriculum. Its flagship program, Loud Class, is a tablet PC-based platform created for interactive studying purposes in which students' responses can be shared and teachers can lead classes through a tablet PC. It also allows teachers to adjust contents to meet changing needs in the class.
Hi, Linda. Good to see you.
There's a lot of countries or school districts that have tablets, but they don't know how to use tablets. It's like having a car without an engine. It looks great, but that's the only factor that goes in. So we're creating this engine that helps students, it helps the teachers, it helps the parents.
And the company is exporting the platform. In Thailand, Cheongdam kicked off a Loud Class pilot program this week.
The world is so small, connected with the ICT. So we think that having more and more experiences from outside that would benefit to our students.
The president of IPST says there are several areas where Thailand should be benchmarking from Korea, especially math and sciences. Industry observers note that Korean firms must fully understand the needs of their target markets and localize their content to further promote their exports. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
Well, it's a gloomy day here in Seoul and the surrounding areas with a few sprinkles, while other parts of the nation have been receiving showers since earlier in the day. Now, the rain has expanded to most parts and it's expected to continue all day long. The southern coastal regions in Jeju will see 20 to 60 millimeters, while the rest of the southern coastal regions will see 10 to 40 millimeters. But beware that the rain could turn to snow in the mountainous regions in Gangwon-do overnight. With that, here are the readings for today. Now, the afternoon temperatures in Seoul will rise to 12, while Daegu and Gwangju will top out at 14 and 15, and Busan will climb to 16 this afternoon. And as for the other regions, Jeju Island will be getting up to 18, and Daejeon and Dokdo-soo see a high of 12 and 14. Now, temperatures will remain above the seasonal averages this week. Highs will hover in the low teens here in Seoul, but beware that there could be a rain on Friday. Well, that's all for me today. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
And that brings us to the end of this edition of Newsline at Noon.
Jin-joo and I will be back at the same time on Tuesday. Goodbye.